All right, Shabbos, good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, for sponsoring all of our shiurim and drushos, Josh and Becca Friedman, and creation of the yahrzeit of Josh's father, Yisrael Yehuda ben Rav Chaim Rafael, and for an aliyah for the neshamas of all of those who were murdered al Kiddush Hashem on Shmini Atzeres, a safe return of all of our chayalim and hostages, and a complete refuah to all of those injured in the various attacks. Sammy and Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents, Hinda Bas Henach Ephraim, Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, and Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram. The Pepper family, in memory of their brother and uncle, Yosef Pepper, Yosef David ben Yaakov Zichron Livracha, and our Week of Learning sponsors, Dr. Ed and Faith Wolf, in honor of the marriage of their son Gideon, Tamali Himmelrich, Shemirat Hashem Nechasan and Kalash Bizocha, to build a Bayis Ne'eman B'Yisrael. We also dedicate, of course, the entire Masechta of Bava Kamma, Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Yomi Charush, who was murdered in Sderot in the firefight by the police station. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, his neshama will have an aliyah, a nechama for his mishpacha, and in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshama should have an aliyah, and all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Chole Yisrael. But let's say with that, let us begin. So a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem, an incredible daf ahead of us. Today's daf is Chof 20, and we are picking up Emir Hashem at the Mishnah on Yud Tes Amud Beis 19b. And the Mishnah says as follows: Keitzad Hashein Moedas. So now, interestingly enough, in the first Mishnah of the Masechta, so we kind of went through all of the different categories. And now in the second parak, we're going through kind of each of the, not subcategories, because they're still primary, these are all avos as well, but we're going through all of the various called subcategories. So Keitzad Hashein Moedas. How does Shein become muad? Or really it says Shein is always muad. What is the nature of Shein damage? Now remember again, definition of Shein is damage the animal does in the course of the pursuit of pleasure. There could be much damage that is done in the pursuit of pleasure. Right? But we're talking about over here, the animal is trying to get hana, and ultimately again does damage. So for example, lechol es hara'ila. So ultimately again, if an animal eats something, so again, animal is walking around and consumes something. My animal walks into Ruvain's field and consumes his produce. That is Shein. So for example, on a simple level, right, my animal goes into Ruvain's field and eats Ruvain's fruit, eats Ruvain's vegetables. That's ultimately, again, a case of Shein. So Gemara says, what happens if my animal goes into Ruvain's field and eats clothing or utensils? So Rabbi says, so again, what is that? That's abnormal. Once it's abnormal, then what is it called? That's going to be called Karen. So therefore, again, the Mishnah says, Mishalim Chatzi Nezek. In that case, ultimately, again, we pay half damages. So the Gemara says, when is this so? B'Rishos HaNizak. Now, also remember, again, in general, Shein is only applicable in the domain of the damaged party. Right? There's no Shein in Rishos HaRabim. Aval B'Rishos HaRabim Pater. But halacha might if you have Shein in Rishos HaRabim, it is going to be Pater. Okay, so also it's a very important halacha as well. V'imnenis Mishalemis Mashenenis. However, that is actually interesting. Even in cases of Shein, where you will be Pater, ultimately, again, the owner of the animal still pays for whatever the animal benefited from. Now, we'll discuss exactly what that line means in the Gemara as well. For example, Kesad, Mishalamis Mashanenis, what does this mean? That the owner of the animal pays for whatever the animal benefited. Achla mitoch harachava. So, for example, if the animal eats from the road, right? Mishalamis Mashanenis. Ultimately, it pays. Now, what that means, we're going to see Harachava means Rishos HaRabim. If the animal goes ahead and consumes something Rishos HaRabim, so ultimately you pay for what was consumed. Mitzide Harachava, but ultimately, again, if you eat from the sides of the road, Mishalames Mashe Zika. Ultimately, again, you pay for what you damaged. Mipesach HaChanus, if the animal eats from the entranceway of the store, Mishalames Mashenenis. Ultimately, you pay for what you benefited from. Mitoch HaChanus, if the animal eats from within the store, Mishalemes Mashe Zika. Ultimately, again, it pays for what it damaged. So again, we'll see exactly what that statement means. We'll get to that case a little bit later on. But L'maiseh Rabbi say we come out with a definition of Shein, what exactly Shane is and where exactly Shane applies. Incredible. Says the Gemara. Let's analyze this a little bit more. So Shane, in general, the damage of Shane is when an animal consumes something that it's normal for it to consume. So Ketzad, so if my animal goes into Reuven's field, right, and goes ahead and eats food that it's normal for it to consume, and drinks liquids that it's normal for it to drink, that's Shane, and because it's Shane, we pay full damages. Remember, you're going to say, the only time you have Chatzi Nezek is two cases. What are the two cases? Keren Tam, or Tzroros. Right? Otherwise, again, remember, Shane, Regel, all of these things are muad from the beginning, so therefore, again, Nezek Shalim, complete damages. V'chein, Chaya shenichnas al chatzar. Similarly, again, I will say, if a Chaya, now remember, a Chaya is a non-domesticated animal that goes into someone else's field, so l'chatzar nizak, v'tarfa behema v'achla basar, and let's say my non-domesticated animal went ahead and, so my Chaya goes into Reuven's field and kills and eats one of Reuven's animals. So what's the halacha? Mishalim nezek shalim. Again, I will say that's Shane. That's Shane. You pay full damages. Upara she'achla sa'orin. But if you have a cow that ate barley, the chamar she'achla krishin, or you have a chamar, a donkey that ate straw, the kelev she'likik es hashemen, or a dog that licked up oil, the chazer she'achla chaticha shal basar, or a chazer that ate a piece of meat, mishalim nezek shalim. All these cases, you still pay nezek shalim. I will say, in that last category of cases, those are all forms of what we'll call abnormal consumption. A dog doesn't normally eat oil. Apparently, a chazer doesn't normally eat meat. Cows don't normally eat barley, and donkeys don't normally eat straw. In other words, we're going to see they eat it under duress, but they wouldn't commonly eat it. So Amar Papa says, but yet it's still called Shane. So Papa says, based on this, Amar Papa, Hashta de Amrit Komidi de Lav Arche Va'achlale, Ayedeh Adchak Shmei Achila. So now we see, by the way, that even something that the animal wouldn't normally eat, but would consume if there's nothing else to eat, that's called Achila. That's called consumption, and therefore that's called Shane. Therefore, again, Haishunra da'achla tamri, if a cat eats dates, the chamra da'achla binsa, or a donkey eats a fish, mishalim nezek shalim. Ultimately, again, you pay full damages. So I both say, so this is actually interesting. So really what you have over here is you have like a spectrum. If the animal eats something that it's normally accustomed to eat, that's called Shane. If the animal eats something abnormal, for example, an animal eats a kli, or an animal eats an article of clothing, totally abnormal, what is that? That's Karen. We saw that in the Mishnah. Then there's this in-between case of an animal that eats a food item, but it doesn't normally eat this item. In other words, it'll eat it like we'll call it under duress, right? But it's a food item. That's still called Shane. That's still called Shane. Incredible. So a couple of interesting cases. Hu chamra, da'achol nama, opal sela sala. There was a donkey. Suppose the case over here is Reuven's donkey ate a loaf of bread belonging to Shimon. Now the loaf of bread itself was inside of a basket. So what did the donkey do? The donkey ate the bread and chewed the basket. Rashi says over la'asa lishnachrina pal say sad kol shafine. So the donkey ate the basket, chewed on the basket. So we'll say chayve Rav Yehuda l'shalim nezek shalim anamo v'asal lechatzi nezek. So ultimately, again, Rav Yehuda said that Reuven, right, the damager, was chayv to pay complete damages for the loaf. Why? What's the loaf? Consumption of the loaf is regel, and half damages for the basket. Because what will the basket be? That'll be Karen. The basket will be Karen, right? Sorry, not regal, Shane. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Consumption of the bread will be Shane. Oh, Sammy, you were good. You got it right. Thank you. Right. Ultimately, again, Shane, and the chewing of the basket will be regal. The consumption of the loaf will be Shane, and the chewing on the basket will be Karen, and therefore full damages for the loaf, half damages for the basket. So the Gemara says as follows: V'amai. I don't understand. Let's say often animals are sloppy. So because animals are sloppy, if an animal is eating a loaf of bread that's in the basket, it would be common for as the animal is eating the loaf to end up what? Chewing on the basket. So therefore, again, we should say that the chewing of the basket is also part of shame, and therefore there should be complete damages. To which the Gemara says, you're right, but what's the case? The achal v'hadar palis. So I was saying, actually, interestingly enough, the case is not that the animal chewed on the basket while eating the loaf. In fact, the case was the animal ate the loaf, and then after it ate the loaf, it went back and it chewed on the basket. So that's a case of abnormal damage. So therefore, again, that's what Yehuda said for the loaf, that's going to be shame, full damages, and for the basket, that is going to be karen, half damages. Incredible. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, pas archehu. I'm sorry, father pas. So the Gemara says, pas archehu. Now, is it normal for a donkey to eat bread? Is that considered to be normal? After all, the Gemara says, upas archehu or minu. Achla pas ubasar v'tavshil mishalim chatzi nezek. If an animal goes ahead and eats bread, or meat, or a cooked dish, he only pays, right, the owner of the animal only pays chatzi nezek. So I'll say what that sounds like over here is that consumption of bread by a behema is considered to be karen, it's considered to be totally abnormal. To which the Gemara says, my lab behema, aren't we talking about a behema over here? To which the Gemara says, no, lo bechaya, we're talking about a non-domestic animal. So the Gemara says, chaya basa archehu, but a chaya eats meat. Why would consumption of a meat by a chaya considered to be abnormal? The mitvi. The Gemara says the meat is roasted. So apparently chaya doesn't eat roasted meat. Who knew? The Gemara says, the other possibility is bitvia, that we're talking about over here a deer. A deer is a chaya, but a deer doesn't normally eat either meat or bread. The other possibility is bebehema. We're talking about an animal, ubipsora. And ultimately, again, the food in question is on a table, and it would be uncommon, ultimately, again, for an animal to eat, for a behema to eat food off of a table. Okay, interesting. Top of Chaf, 20a. Supposed to be an interesting case. Hu barcha de chaza lifta apuma de dana. Shabbos say there was a goat who saw a turnip. Lifta is a turnip, right? A turnip on top of a barrel. So what happened? Sarich, so the goat kind of climbed its way up the barrel. Achla lifta, he ate the turnip. Vitavi ledana, and he broke the basket. He broke the barrel. So a lot going on over here. So the Gemara says, Chayve Rava alifta va'adana nezek shalim. So interestingly enough, in this case, Rava held that the owner is chayiv complete damages for both the turnip and the barrel. That's interesting, right? Because again, looking at this, you would have said what? The turnip is shame, but what's the barrel? Karen. Right? Bepashtos, it's Karen. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, my taima, kevan da arche lemecha lifta, arche name lesurucha lemsalik. In other words, we'll say, once it's normal for the animal to eat the turnip, so it's normal for the animal to scale the barrel and get the turnip. In other words, it's normal for an animal not just to consume, but it's normal for an animal to do what it needs to do in order to get its food. Therefore, Allah Lamaisa, once the turnip is on top of the barrel, it's normal. It's normal for the animal to go ahead and scale the barrel, and therefore, again, it will not be karen. So we'll say, so whether that's called regel or whether that's called shein, maybe it's all just under the umbrella of shein together. Okay, incredible. Let's go weiter. Amr Ilfa. Ilfa said as follows. Behema b'rshus harabim. Listen to this interesting case. You have an animal in rshus harabim, public domain. Upashta savara va'achlami al gabi chaverta is an interesting case. So let's imagine the following situation. Ruvain's animal is walking in rshus harabim, and what does it do? It stretches out its neck and it eats from the food that's on the back of Shimon's animal. Then I will say, now remember again, this is a case of consumption. Therefore, it's a case of shein. But remember, shein is only chayiv where? In Rishus HaNizak, in the property of the damaged party. Shein is not chayiv in Rishus Harabim. So now in this case over here, Reuven and Shimon's animals are both in Rishus Harabim. Reuven's animal extends its neck and eats off the back of Shimon's animal. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Gabe chaverta ki chatzar hanizak dami. ultimately, again, about say, so the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says that the back of the animal is considered to be like the chutzner of the nizak. So an interesting case here. In other words, I will say, here what's happening over here. The back of Shimon's animal is considered to be the chutzner ultimately of Shimon. And therefore this is considered to be an act of shein done in the Rishus HaYachid. Interesting. The Gemara says, let's bring another case that supports this. Haisa kupaso mufsheles lachorav. So we'll say, listen to this case over here. Let's say again, I'm walking. Now the truth is, this is right. Haisa kupaso mufsheles lachorav upashta savara va'achla va'achlimenu chayaves. Ultimately, again, I will say salachal myself. Let's say again, the kupaso mufsheles lachorav, which literally means it could be either a person or an animal carrying ultimately again a kupa, a sack, right? The sack or a bundle of food. It's hanging behind. Upashtat savar, and the animal extends its neck and eats from the sack. Eats from the sack. What's the halacha? Chayaves. Ultimately, again, the offending animal, the damager, is going to be chayiv. Kida Amarava, we'll say Rav explains what's the case over here. Bikofetzes. Now Rashi says, we'll say it's actually the top Rashi of the Amid. Top Rashi of the Amid. What does it mean, kofetzes? What does it mean, kofetzes? Rashi says over here, shekafza va'achla al savara she'in darka b'kach. So we'll say the case over here is the animal jumped up and ate, which is not a normal case, right? Right, al savara actually changes al savara to right al savaro. She'in darka b'kach v'told the kerenu v'chayeves chatzi nezek. So we'll say, so Rav explains over here, when the animal jumps up, I guess like on its hind legs, and goes ahead and eats, that's considered to be a non-normative case. And halacha l'may said that'll be karen. Hachanami b'kofetzes. Ultimately, again, this is also talking about a case of kofetzes. Now we'll say, now the case of kofetzes, it would seem to be, again, could either be a case just where the animal jumps up on its hind legs, or it could also be a case where the animal jumps up, rests its hind legs on the other animal, and consumes like that. But either way, that's a non-normative case, and therefore that's karen. Interesting. Vehecha itmar de Rava. And I will say, where was Rava's original kofetzes case mentioned? Listen to this. Aha. Tanaboshia. Behema b'rishos harabim. If a behema is in rishos harabim, halcha va'achla petura. So we'll say, if the animal is in rishos harabim and it's walking and eating, it's pater. Because we'll say, remember again, eating in rishos harabim is what? Is shein, and shein is pater in Rosh Hashanah. So if the animal is walking, and Allah Lamaisa consumes, the animal is pater, right? We're going to say the animal, the owner is pater. Amda va'achla chayeves. If the animal stands still and eats, then ultimately the owner will be chayiv. I will say, now maishna halcha the archehu. I will say, now what's the distinction? So this is actually a very interesting statement, according to Rava. Raboshia. Raboshia says if the animal is walking in Rosh Hashanah and consumes, ultimately the owner is pater. If the animal stands still and consumes, ultimately will be chayiv. So I asks the Gemara, Maishna halcha, why? Why? When the animal walks and it consumes, why is it pater? To archehu, because Rabbi say that is the normal case. That's common. That's common. To archehu, and therefore say because it's common, therefore again that's shein in Rosh Hashanah, and therefore one is pater. The Gemara says, Amdaname archehu, but I don't understand. For an animal to stand still and eat, that's also normal. So why should there be a chiyuv in that case? Amarava b'kofetzes. So I would say this is actually very interesting, which the Gemara says, you're right, we're talking about a case where what? Where the animal jumped up. Animal jumped up on its hind legs and went ahead and ate. I will say that's abnormal. That's abnormal. So because remember again, any case of abnormal behavior is going to fall under the umbrella of keren. And remember, keren is chayiv in rishus harabim. So that'll be the case. Interesting. By Rabbi Zera. So what's Rabbi Zera asks another kasha? Miskalgel mahu. So I will say, what about the case, ultimately again, of rolling damage? Rolling damage. So the Gemara says, Miskalgel mahu. Right? What happens if halacha l'maisa? Halacha l'maisa. So we're going to see exactly what this circumstance is in just a moment. Mahu. Mechidami. So what's the case? The Gemara says, Kigon de kaima amir b'rishos hayachid. The kamiskalgel va'asi mirishos hayachid l'rishos harabim mai. So let's listen to the following scenario. What happens if there is we'll call it a bundle of wheat. Bundle of wheat. An amir is a bundle. The bundle is situated in Rishus HaYachid. Now what's happening over here? The animal is going, right? So the animal, so just to frame the case, Ruvain's animal goes into Shimon's chutzner. And now what happens? It begins to roll the bundle from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, and consumption then occurs in Rishus HaRabim. So what's the halacha in that case? So the Gemara says, Mai, what's the halacha in that case? Look at Rashi for just a moment. It's Rashi's second line from the top. Kigon de Kamma Amir Birshus HaYachid. So Rashi says over here, Ubehema Birshus HaRabim, Umiskalgeles Va'asi Mirishus HaYachid Lirishus HaRabim. So Rabbi says, so this is actually an interesting case over here, right? So ultimately, again, so the animal brings the bundle from private domain to public domain. And now consumption occurs in public domain. So what's the shaila? So the Gemara says, Mai, what do we do in this case? Now look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi says, Mai, basra achila azlinon uptura, o basar deshakla leazlinon v'chayeves. V'hu adin nami ibehemas b'rishus hanizak, var b'rishus harabim, v'gilgalto b'rishus harabim l'shsechen. Both sides. Hear the interesting case over here? The case over here is the Maisa began in Rishus HaYachid, but ultimately, again, the consumption occurs in Rishus HaRabim. So essentially, how do we look at this? Do we say that since the animal got the bundle from Rishus HaYachid, this is called Shein in Rishus HaYachid, and therefore, again, the owner of the animal is Chayiv? Or do we say that since consumption took place in Rishus HaRabim, therefore this is Shein Rishus HaRabim, and therefore what? And therefore, ultimately, again, it's Pater. That's the Shaila. Mai. So the Gemara says, so Tashma, the Tani Rabbi Shmuel, essentially, this is reminiscent of what we saw in yesterday's daf as well. Do we look at the beginning, right, the point of origin, or do we look at the end? Now the truth is, it's not exactly the same, because remember, the consumption itself, which is the actual act of Shein, occurs in Rishus HaRabim. But the origin, right, in other words, but the bundle being consumed ultimately was taken by the animal from Rishus HaYachid. So that's the Shaila. So the Gemara says, "My Tashma, Tanya Bichia, Masui." Right? If you have a bundle. So mas miktsasa b'fnei miktsasa b'chutz. Part of it is in Rishus HaYachid, and part of it is in Rishus HaRabim. Achla b'fnei mechayeves. If the animal eats it in Rishus HaYachid, the animal's chayiv. Achla b'chutz. If it eats it outside, ultimately again it's pater. So the Gemara says, "My lav miskalgel v'asya." We're not talking about a case where again the bundle's being moved. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, it's not being moved. Actually, it's stationary." So the Gemara says, "Ema achla amashe b'fnim chayaves amashe b'chutz p'tura." The Gemara says, "No. So really, what you should be saying is like this: if you have a bundle, we'll say essentially this case the Gemara should bring up over here is the bundle straddles Rishus HaYachid and Rishus HaRabim, straddles it. So now the halacha is, if the animal consumes the part of the bundle situated in Rishus HaYachid, you're chayiv. Situated in Rishus HaRabim, ultimately again you're pater. So the Gemara says, why not just say that? Ibai sema ki Kamma Rabbi bepsila da aspasta. We will say it's possible ultimately again that what Rabbi Chia was talking about ultimately again was with aspasta. Now I will say aspasta is like a long stringy plant. So look at Rashi, Ibai Sema, Li'olam kidiktani achlasa bifnim, chayaves al kulo, achlasa b'chutz, petura al kulo, v'lo tisha te gilgal milsa. In reality, I will say, if you eat it in Rishus HaYachid, you're chayiv. If you eat it in Rishus HaRabim, you're pater. But ultimately, again, so the Gemara says, and you can't really learn anything about gilgal, about rolling it. Why? So the Gemara says, because this particular case was talking about aspasta, which is long. And once you go ahead and you move one end of it, the other end automatically moves as well. Okay, so I will say there's not exactly resolution about this. I will say, now this happens to be a very interesting case. A very interesting case about what you do regarding Gilgal. So Rabbi say, interestingly enough, the way the halacha is going to paskin is liability is determined by consumption. Wherever the item is consumed, that is going to generate liability. So therefore, again, If the animal takes a bundle from Rishus HaYachid, but ultimately again doesn't consume it, rolls it out to Rosh Hashanah and goes ahead and consumes it there, so that's going to be Shein Birshus Harabim, where ultimately again there's not going to be liability. Now, both I just want to point out something very important, which we're going to get to a little bit later on today, which is even in cases where you are patur on Shein, you're still going to have to pay something, right? In other words, because at the end of the day, any time my animal benefits from someone else's property, there's going to have to be some level of liability. What that liability is, we have to see. Okay, good. So let's go weiter. So we'll go weiter. Achlok sus. Now remember again, I will say the next case the Mishnah brought up was, so if my animal, Reuven's animal goes into Shimon's field and eats Shimon's fruit and eats Shimon's vegetables, so that's called Shein, is going to be chayiv. But if Reuven's animal goes into Shimon's field and eats Reuven's clothing or eats Reuven's utensils, that's Karen. That's Karen, and therefore you only pay Chatzi Nezek. So the Gemara says as follows. So now we'll say, so I just want to point out, the way the Mishnah read was as follows. The way the Mishnah read was like this. So an animal is muad to eat fruit and vegetables. And if the animal eats ksus or kalim, ultimately again you pay half damages. So we'll say, so that sentence of eating fruits and vegetables, and then if an animal eats ksus or kalim, you pay half damages, that looks like one sentence. So the Gemara says, Ahiyah, what is this going on? What is that statement ultimately again of Mishalim Chatzi Nezek going on? To which the Gemara says, Amarav, Akulu. Ultimately, again, I will say it's actually going on everything. What my time, but what's the reason? Kala Mishane Uba Achar Vishina Bo Pater. I will say this is actually very interesting. Take a look at Rashi. Akulu, it's actually right across. Hadik Tani Masisim B'Shus Harabim Pitura Akulu Kai Afilu Aksus V'Kelim the Shinoi Havatol the Karen. So we'll say, now listen to this. Now, the next line of the Mishnah, which is actually really what the Gemara is going on over here, says as follows. When is this so? B'Shus Hanizak. Aval B'Shus Harabim Pater. They both say, now listen to how the Mishnah reads, right? So the Mishnah reads like this. The Mishnah tells me that if Reuven's animal goes into Shimon's field and goes and eats peros and yerakos, right, fruits and vegetables, that's shein and you're chayiv. Then it says, if it eats achlaf, the Reuven's animal eats clothing or utensils in Shimon's field, what's the halacha? That's karen, abnormal chatzi nezek. And then it says, when is this so? When the damage is happening in Rishus HaNizak. But if the damage is happening in Rishus Harabim, ultimately again, Reuven is pater. They're both saying, here's what's interesting. The question is how to read that. What if Reuven's animal eats Shimon's ksus or kalim in Rishus Harabim? So now both say, how do you read the Mishnah? Is the Mishnah saying that ultimately again, Reuven's still pater for that? Or no, that's going on, peros v'yirakos, yirakos v'peros. But ksus and kalim, you'll still be chayv shalom. So watch this, Rabbi. This is incredible. So Rav says that no, there is even exemption, even if Reuven's animal eats Shimon's ksus and kalim in Rishus Harabim, ultimately again, Reuven is pater. Now what's the reason? Rabbi says it's incredible. What's the reason? The Gemara says, I'm sorry, this is Rav. He says, "Kol mashana uba achar v'shinabo," because we'll say any time you do something abnormal, and as a result, someone does something abnormal to you, the second person is pater. We'll say, what does that mean? The act of leaving clothing and utensils in Rishus Harabim is abnormal. People don't do that, right? You're not supposed to do that. So now Reuven did something abnormal by leaving clothing and utensils in Rishus Harabim. If now Shimon's animal comes along, actually I'm going to keep on mixing up the names. If Shimon leaves behind ksus and kalim in Rishus Harabim, and now as a result, Reuven's animal comes along and what? Eats those items. So now the fact that Shimon did something abnormal, and now Reuven does something abnormal, Reuven is pater. Reuven is pater. Anytime, in other words, essentially what Rav is saying is like this. Anytime you change the normal rules of engagement, you're chayiv for, in other words, no one has any liability for what happens to you afterwards. So therefore, Shimon, you put your utensils and you put your clothing in Rishus Harabim, and now Reuven's animal comes along and eats it, Reuven's not chayiv. You should not have put your stuff there in the beginning, and therefore there's no liability. So that's how Rav reads the Mishnah. Shmuel says, no. Lo shanu ela peros v'yirakos. No. There's exemption ultimately, again, if Shimon's animal comes and eats your fruits and vegetables, because that's shein birshus harabim, which will be pater on. Aval ksusu kelim chayeves. But if Reuven's animal comes and eats Shimon's utensils or clothing, that's Karen. That's Karen, and there is liability ultimately again for Karen birshus harabim. Incredible. V'cheinu Reish Lakish, Baz Reish Lakish letame, and Baz Reish Lakish the same word Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish shtei paros. This in general is an interesting case. In general, when you do something abnormal, and as a result of your abnormal act, someone else damages you, is the damager chayiv or not? Is damager chayiv or not? So the Gemara says as follows. Dam Reish Lakish, shtei paros birshus harabim. If you have two cows or surabim, and what happens? Achas revutza va'achas ma'alachas. So I'll say one cow A is squatting, right, like squatting down, and cow B is walking. Ba'ata ma'alachas beravutza ptura. So I'll say if the walking cow kicks the squatting cow, ultimately again the walking cow is pater. Why, Rabbi say? Why? Because Lamaisa, squatting cow in Rosh Hashanah is abnormal. Right? No standing, right? No idling, right? No standing. Say if Rabbi say Salach Lamaisa again, so you did something abnormal by allowing your cow to squat, the cow afterwards gets damaged, there's no liability for the damager. However, Revutza b'ma'aleches chayeves. That's interesting. If the squatting cow damages the walking cow, then there is liability. Which makes sense, because that would be Karen Rosh Hashanah. So I will say, so therefore, again, interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa. So just the machlok is how to read the Mishnah. So Rav says that halacha l'maisa, what it's saying is like this. If halacha l'maisa, Shimon leaves clothing and utensils in Rosh Hashanah, and afterwards Ruvain's ox comes along and eats it, there's no liability for Ruvain, because ultimately, again, if you do something abnormal and then someone else damages you as a result of your abnormal activity, there is no liability. Reish Lakish says, Shmuel says no. The exemption ultimately is only for peros v'yirakos, but if Ruvain's cow damages Shimon's ksus and kelim, that's Karen, and ultimately again you'll be chayiv. Incredible. So what's this machlokes? First white line. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lo Shana Ela Peros Yirakos. Rabbi Yochanan agrees with Shmuel. He says the only exemption is for Peros and Yirakos, which will be Shein Rosh Hashanah. Aval Ksusu Kelim chayeves, but ultimately again you will be chayiv for Ksusu Kelim. I lema Rabbi Yochanan, let's say the Reish Lakish. So say that Rabbi Yochanan does hold the Reish Lakish. Afilu b'shtei paros. Even in the case of the two cows we just mentioned, though the olam is like Islay, he really holds ultimately again of Reish Lakish, and therefore he'll agree in the aforementioned case of the two cows, the squatting cow and the walking cow. But ksus avdi demanchi, says ksus avdi inshi demanchi glimi umispechi aval behema lavarcha. I will say what Rabbi Yochanan will say is like this. It is normal for people to just momentarily put down their utensils in Rosh Hashanah. That is common. That's not called an abnormality. So because it's not called an abnormality, therefore, again, if halacha l'maisa, Ruvain's ox damages or eats Shimon's ksus and kelim, that's going to be called Karen. But he agrees with Reish Lakish in the two cases of the squatting cow and the walking cow. Incredible. So Rabbi say, Salach l'maisa, how do we paskin? So the Rambam paskins like Shmuel. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi say, if Ruvain's cow goes ahead and eats Shimon's, eats peros v'yirakos, that's going to be pater, because that's ultimately, again, that is going to be a case of shein in Rosh Hashanah for which you are pater. However, Rabbi say, ksus and kelim, if Ruvain's cow eats Shimon's ksus and kelim, then there is liability. They will say, what's the liability? That'll be Keren Birshus Harabim, and therefore halacha l'maisa you will have to pay half damages. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Vimnenis Mishalames. They will say, now this is interesting. So remember again, what did we see in the Mishnah? What we saw in the Mishnah was the following halacha. That even in cases where you would not be chayiv for shein, you're always chayiv for what the animal consumed, right? So for just a typical example, right? Ruvain's cow goes ahead and eats Shimon's Peiros V'Yerakos in Rishus Harabim. So we'll say that is a case of Shein in Rishus Harabim. What's the halacha? What's the halacha? What's the halacha? Pater. But I will say, but still the Mishnah says, at the end of the day, Ruvain, you got some benefit from Shimon's property. So if you got some benefit, you should pay something. So that's why the Mishnah says, Mishalames Mashanis, you pay what you benefited. So the Gemara says, the Kamma, what is that? Like, how do you measure that? So Rabba Amar, Demei Amir. So Rabba says the value of straw. In other words, what we look at essentially is, listen, Ruvain, you were going to have to feed your animal. Now, your animal ate Shimon's produce. So now what's the good news for you? You don't have to feed your animal. So we look at, so obviously you saved money. So how much money do you save? So we look at the amount of straw which is inexpensive. We look at, Ruvain, how much straw would you have had to feed your animal, right? And how much straw did you save now that your animal ate Shimon's produce? And that's the value of straw that he saved. That's the value that Ruvain's going to have to pay to Shimon. Rava says, the amount of barley that you would get when barley is inexpensive. Okay, Tanya Kavase de Rabba, Tanya Kavase de Rava. There's a price that supports both of them. Tanya Kavase de Rabba, Rabbi Shmuel Yochai Omer, Ein Lo Mishalames Ela Demei Amar Bilva. The only amount you pay is the amount of straw that you saved, that you don't have to feed your animal. Tanya Kavase de Rava, Imnanis Mishalames Mashenanis. So Bryce that supports Rava. Ultimately, again, if you benefit, you pay the amount that you benefit. Kesad, achla kav o kabayim. If, again, the animal ate a kav or two kavim, ein omrim tishalim demain. You don't have to pay the actual value of what you consumed. Ella, omdin kama adam rotze lahachel behemto, davaharayla afapi she'en aragil. Rather, again, ultimately, we look at how much would a person pay to feed their animals something that they wouldn't normally feed them, but would satisfy them. Lefichach, achal chitin o davar harala. So we'll say, so essentially, bottom line is, halacha l'maisa, we look at the fact that Ruvain, now you don't have to feed your animal. So because you don't have to feed your animal, so ultimately, you benefited. So we look at how much did you save. So, right, whether we value it in straw, whether we value it in barley, right? Okay, so that's a machlokes. But bottom line is, we look at what would be essentially like the most inexpensive food that you would have fed your animal, right? And therefore, how much did you save by not having to feed your animal? And that amount, that's what you have to pay. Now, I will say, as opposed to typical shein, where what do you have to pay in the case of shein? What do you pay in the case of shein? What you damaged. So the chap over here is, you don't pay what you damaged, rather what do you pay? What you saved. Okay. We'll say now, this actually yields a very interesting exception. Lefichach, achla chitin o davar harala p'tura. I will say what this will come out is, if the animal ate something detrimental to it, right? The animal ate food high in trans fat, right? High carbs, right? Empty carbs, right? So we'll say, if the animal went ahead and ate something detrimental to it, in that case, the owner doesn't have to pay, right? Because I will say, why? Why? Because again, in this case, the animal owner didn't benefit. In other words, the owner has to pay what he benefited. If you would have this kind of case where the animal eats something detrimental to it, the owner doesn't pay. Good. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Rav Chisda said, "Lahavis kaban ba'arta betchuma." You weren't with us. You weren't with us in the evening, inside of the tchum, right in the city, when we were talking about the following case: the ibaylan mili ma'al yusa. We were talking about some great stuff. Right, so I say, this is Rav Chisda telling Rabbi Bar Chama, you really missed out. Right, we were hanging out together, Baruch Hashem, in one evening, and we were talking about great stuff. What we're talking about, Amr my mili mal yusa. What was the great stuff? Amr will say this actually is great stuff. Some very interesting cases over here. Listen to this. We'll say this here's the case we're talking about. Hadar b'chatzer chaver shalomi daito tzarich lahalo scharo in tzarich. We'll say if Ruvain lives in Shimon's property, and by the way, when we say live in his property, we mean squat in his property, right? In other words, he is living, right? Ruvain's living in Shimon's property without Shimon's permission. Without Shimon's permission, does Ruvain have to pay Shimon rent or not? That's the shaila. Says, one second, hechi dami. What's the case? Ilema b'chatzar delo kaima le'igra, the gavra delo avid lemegar. So I'll say if we're talking about a case where, so remember, Reuven is living in Shimon's property. So if we're talking about a case where Shimon doesn't rent out this property, and Reuven has other places he could live. He doesn't need to live here. He's just choosing to squat here, right? So again, he doesn't need to. So I'll say if that's the case, then this is a situation of zelo nana v'zelo chaser. So I'll say, interestingly enough, Reuven is not really benefiting. Why is Reuven not benefiting? Because he has somewhere else to live, and Shimon is not losing. Why is Shimon not losing? Because halacha l'maisa, he doesn't rent it out anyway. He's not being deprived of rental income. So I'll say, so in general, in a case of zelo ne'aneh, v'zelo chaser, you can't claim anything, right? Then Shimon doesn't really have a right to claim anything. On the other hand, ela b'chaser de kaima le'igra, the gaver de aval lemegar. Now I'll say, so rather maybe it's a case where what? Where Shimon does rent out the property, and Reuven does need a place to stay. If that's the case, then it's a situation of zen and chaser. Then I will say then it's a case of Reuven is benefiting and Shimon is losing because Shimon can rent out the property. In which case, of course, there should be liability. To which the Gemara says, no, lo tzvicha. Listen to this. B'chaser de la kaima la'agra, the gavra de avid lamegar. I will say the case is where Shimon does not rent out the property, but Reuven does need a place to live. So I will say, so ultimately, again, what is this a case? This is a case of zenene v'zelo chaser. So Reuven is benefiting, but Shimon isn't losing anything. So we'll say, so therefore, in this kind of case, does Reuven have to pay rent to Shimon? So my matzi amrle my chasarteich. So Reuven can say to Shimon, what's the problem over here? You're not losing anything, right? I'm not depriving you of rental income, right? If anything, I'm looking after the place, right? You should thank me, right? You should pay me, right? You should thank me, all right? I'm not causing you to lose out on anything. On the other, Dilma, on the other hand, matzi amar. On the base, Matzi Amar Ha'is Hanis. Shimon can say to Reuven, but Reuven, you're getting a tangible benefit from me, right? In other words, you need a place to live. You're getting a place to live. You should have to go ahead and pay me for the rental. So I'll say, so that's the Shaila. Amarle Masnisi. I will say, now what I will point out is as follows. Obviously, I will say, the best way to frame this case is, if Reuven, once Shimon discovers this, the best way to frame this case is Shimon didn't know what was happening, right? So Reuven's been living there for the last 2 months. So really the shaila is, could Shimon sue Reuven for back rent? Obviously, I was like, going forward, you have a right to tell someone, I don't want you in my property, right? And no one has a right to say, well, come on, what's the problem? I'm not depriving you of anything. It's your property. You have the right. So this case works best where you did not know, right? So Shimon didn't know that Reuven was there. So now, right, retroactively, what Shimon wants is back rent. And essentially, Reuven says, I don't understand, I didn't deprive you of anything. So the Gemara says, Amarle, Mas Nisan, it's a Mishnah. So, hey, Mas Nisan, which Mishnah is it? So I will say, so listen to this. So, hey, Mas Nisan. So now, remember again, just to frame the conversation over here. So remember, Rav Chisda was saying to Rami Bar Chama, so you missed a great conversation last night. We were hanging out last night, you missed a great conversation. Rav Chisda proceeds to tell Rami Bar Chama what they spoke about. Then ultimately, again, Rav Chisda said it's a Mishnah. Rami Bar Chama said, what Mishnah is it? So Amarle, so he says to him, so Rav Chisda says, Rami Bar Chama, L'chita shamishli. When you serve me, after you serve me, I'll tell you what Mishnah it was. Shakol sudrei, so he took his cloak, karachla, and he folded it up. Now we'll discuss why that whole exchange had to happen. Amarle, listen to this. Imnanis, mishamis mashanis. They both say it's our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah says, both say, that remember again, when you perform an act of shein, bershus harabim, even though you're patur on shein, you have to pay for what you benefited. So what do you see from here? Anytime you get hana from someone, there is an obligation to pay. There are no free lunches, right? Whatever you benefit from in this world from someone else, you have to pay for. So therefore, again, Reuven's living in Shimon's property, as much as Reuven did not deprive Shimon of anything, because it's not a rental property, but still, if Shimon gets benefit, he's got to pay. Amar Rava said, Kamma lo chali v'lo margish gavra dimare saye. So let's listen to this. So it's actually interesting. Look at Rashi just a moment. Gavra dimare saye rami barchama. So he says, ultimately, again, Kamma lo chali v'lo margish gavra dimare saye. How great is it? Literally, again, Kamma lo chali, how much he doesn't get ill and he doesn't feel anything negative. Gavra dimare saye. Someone who HaKadosh Baruch Hu helps him out. And Rashi says over here, Gavra dimare saye rami barchama. It's referring to Rami barchama. The Gemara says, why? Da'af agav dilo dami demasnisin kabla minei. Even though, in fact, these two things are not comparable, nevertheless, ultimately, again, he accepted it from him. Now, we'll say, now, why are the two things not comparable? Why is the case of Reuven living in Shimon's chatzah, Reuven living in Shimon's house, not comparable to the animal who eats from someone else's property in Rosh Hashanah? Why not? Hai zenene v'zeh chaser, v'hai zenene v'zeh lo chaser. Both say it's not comparable at all. When Reuven's animal eats Shimon, right, from Shimon's property, ultimately, again, Shimon has a loss. So of course you're going to have to pay in some way for the loss. Of course you have to pay in some way. Now whether or not you have to pay what you damaged, or whether or not you have to pay ultimately what you benefited, that's a separate discussion. Right? But Lamaisa, ultimately Shimon has a loss. That's different than our case. In our case over here, Reuven's living in Shimon's property, and I both say what? Shimon has no loss. Shimon has no loss. So you can't compare it. Vrayim Barchama, I what Rabbi Barchama say, Stam Peiros Pirshus Harabim Afkuri Mafker Lahu. So Rabbi Barchama will say, no, even in the case where Reuven's animal eats Shimon's produce in Shus Harabim, that's also not a loss. Why not? Rabbi saying, if you put produce down in Shus Harabim, if you put produce down in Shus Harabim, what are you essentially doing? You're mafkir it. In other words, that's crazy. That's craziness. In other words, and if you're putting that down, obviously, you're being mafkir. So we'll say, so because of that, there's no loss over there either. There's no loss over there either. So Tanan. Shabbos say, let's analyze this. Shabbos say, so this just happens to be, so now what we're getting into are some of these additional cases of Zenena v'zalo chaser. So this is Tanan. Hamakif chaver mishal shuchos. Shabbos say over here, what you have is as follows. You have, actually Rashi has a picture of it. If you can imagine for just a moment, you have Reuven. Reuven has 3 fields. And Reuven's 3 fields border Shimon's interior field on 3 sides. Okay. V'gader as harishon, v'es hashniya, v'es hashlishis, ein mechayven oso. So I will say, so Shimon, the owner of the exterior fields, decides to put up a fence on the 3 sides in which he abuts Shimon's interior field. So I will say, so again, Reuven can't force Shimon to go ahead and pay for any of that fencing. Right? Because again, remember again, Reuven's doing it for his benefit. Haravias mechayven oso. Let's say now Shimon puts up a field on the 4th side, right? So on the 4th side, which in the image is the open side, he puts up a fence on the 4th side because he wants to enclose the entire area of the field. So at that point, again, now Reuven can force Shimon to chip in for the fence. For the fence. Rashi says over here, ein mechayven oso. Ein mechayven as Shimon klum de mai ahanile hare sedei pesuchim v'tzaravias. Haravias Rashi says imhu hayalo the Reuven dalit salas me'aberuchos shel Shimon the gadron mechayven as Shimon lases lo es chalkoba mechitzas v'neo. So we'll say so once Reuven puts up that 4th side of the fence, now Shimon has the benefit of having a fully enclosed field. At that point, ultimately, again, so Reuven could tell Shimon that he has to chip in. Shmamina, what do you see from here? Zenene v'zelo chaser chayiv. So Rabbi say, what do you see from here? Now remember, Reuven is putting up the 4th side. Why? Why is Reuven putting up the 4th side? For himself. Right? So this is a case of zenene. So again, Shimon now is benefiting. Right? Shimon, the interior field, is benefiting. But ultimately, again, Shimon's benefit doesn't come at a loss to Reuven, right? Reuven's doing this anyway. And yet, what do we see? That Allah Lamaisa, Shimon, the interior field guy, could still be told that he has to share. So you see from here that there is liability even in a case of Zenene v'zelo chaser. To which the Gemara says, no, shiny hasam, the amrale at garamta li hakefa yisera. Rabbi say it's different over there. Why? It's different because halacha lamaisa, Reuven could claim to Shimon, ultimately, again, the presence of your field requires me extra security and protection. Look at Rashi. Hakefi yisera, the lav sadeh shel Shimon bein sadosav havisagli b'mechitzos chitzonos v'havu kol sadosav gidurim. So we'll say, so remember again, had Shimon's field not been in the middle of Reuven's field, Reuven could have just made an exterior fence. Now he has to make all of this interior fencing as well. So therefore, again, it is a case of zenene v'zeh chaser. Ultimately, again, the presence of Shimon is ultimately causing Reuven to have to take additional actions. Tashma, Rabbi Yossi, Im Amad Nikaf V'Gader Saravias Megalgil and Allah Vesakol. So I'll say, what do you see from here? So Rabbi Yossi says, if the interior field, the guy in the interior, i.e. Shimon, gets up and Shimon puts up the fourth side, we cause him to share in the cost of all of the other walls as well. Taima V'Gader Nikaf. Now the reason is because Shimon did that. Ham Makif, but if Reuven, the exterior field guy, did it, Pater, ultimately Shimon wouldn't have to chip in at all. What do you see from here? Shmamina, zenene, v'zelo chaser pater. You see from here that ultimately, again, when one party benefits, but the other party is not put at a disadvantage at all, ultimately a pater. Shiny hasam to Amrlei, say lididi, sagili benetira barzuza. It's different to Rabbi say why? Because Reuven, the exterior field guy, could say, you know what, as far as I'm concerned, I'm good with just like a row of bushes. That's all I need. You because of you put up a more significant wall. Therefore, you have to share in the expense. Okay, so I'll say, so just to be clear, what are we doing over here? We're focusing on one case, which is zenene v'zelo chaser. When you have two people, and one of them gets benefit, right? But the benefit doesn't come at the expense of the other party. Is the benefiting party still obligated to compensate the party that's not losing? So remember again, the paradigmatic case of this is Reuven lives in Shimon's house, but Shimon's obviously not living there, right? Nor is Shimon renting it out. So now Reuven is benefiting because he has a place to live. Shimon, however, is not suffering, right? There's no loss to Shimon. So is Reuven obligated to pay Shimon rent or not? So that's the case we're focusing on. Zenene v'zelo chaser. So let's go weiter just for another minute. So Tashma, habayis v'aliyah shel shnayim. Well, it's an interesting case over here. Let's say you have, right, bayis and aliyah shel shnayim. Reuven and Shimon are neighbors. Reuven lives on the lower story, Shimon lives on the upper story. And what happens? Shenaflu. Ultimately, the building fell down. Amr bala aliyah bala bayis. So both say ultimately again, Shimon, who lives on the upper story, says to her, it's the best part. Shimon, who lives on the upper story, says to Reuven, who lives on the lower story, listen, I need you to rebuild. I can't rebuild my house until you rebuild your house. V'hu ein harotzeh. But I will say what happens. But Reuven is not interested. So what's the halacha? So the upper story guy, Shimon, could go ahead and rebuild the entire thing and ultimately occupy the entire building until Reuven, the lower story guy, goes ahead and pays him for the building expenses. You know, we'll say, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem with this tomorrow. Again, we're good. We are good. Right on schedule, Emirat Hashem. Incredible case. I will say, shkoyach. Oh, tomorrow morning, Thanksgiving is a Sunday schedule. So davening 7:15, Emirat Hashem, Daf Yomi at 8 o'clock. We'll just say also stay tuned. I'm going to today, special learning program, Emirat Hashem after Daf Yomi tomorrow. Breakfast and an Iyun Shir, Emirat Hashem on Bava Kamma, a special guest speaker as well. Again, send out the details today. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom. Shkoyach, everyone.